It is really an honor and a pleasure for me to have the privilege of introducing Peter and welcoming him to the front of the room. I think we'll have some presence of New England texts in tonight's talk, and Peter is actually a New Englander who attended Brandeis University as an undergraduate, then arrived here at Penn in 2020. He is a PhD candidate in the English department here, and his dissertation focuses on radical Protestant thinkers in 17th and 18th century Anglo-America. I did extract out of him the working title of his dissertation, which is great. Separatists Among Separatists, Rethinking the Exile Narrative in Early America. We won't hold you to the title, but it's good. As that title suggests, and I think tonight will take us to, those folks are weird. And these texts are hard. And I want to emphasize this, that Peter works on hard texts. We're going to explore tonight some of the odd and obscure corners of early America. Peter also teaches hard books. And he's wonderful at it. And I should say that I have this on firm evidence because I have informants on the ground. As a teacher, he's taught, among other things, 2 seminars in the English departments, now 1 book seminar. And he doesn't do small books. Last semester, his 1 book was the Bible. This semester, his seminar, he's giving himself a break, and his 1 book is Moby Dick, which, as I said, everyone I know is loving. Peter's also been a colleague of mine here in the Penn Libraries. As you might have noticed in his short bio, he was a project manager here for a digital scholarship project we call the Digital Beehive. And last year, Peter had a fellowship, a Mellon Fellowship at the Price Lab for Digital Humanities as part of that work. I don't have time to go into the complexities of that hard book. Perhaps I think it will come up tonight. But you see it on the table here, a remarkable commonplace book, over 1,000 pages, known as The Beehive, composed by Francis Daniel Pastorius in early Pennsylvania. There perhaps is no more complicated early American manuscript. It's an odd assemblage of poetry, epigrams, and extracts from Quaker and non-Quaker sources. And I think we'll hear more about it tonight. The digital project, an annotation project, was really the first time that any significant part of this manuscript has been made public, not just as a series of digital images, but actually as in a usable frame with interpretive and navigational tools. It's hard to emphasize the amount of challenging thinking and, frankly, often very tedious work that went into creating that digital project. Peter was not the only driver of it, but I can say that Peter was the one who got us to the finish line, which is no small thing in digital projects or any other work for that matter. Now this year, I think most of you in the room know this, Peter is the Bristol-Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text. That role has a very long title, but it actually does a lot. Yes, there is dinner planning, and that is no small thing, I can attest. Peter adeptly and smoothly manages the now very complicated technology for this seminar. So he's going to leap up in a minute and push a few buttons so that things work well as external and internal communications, reimbursements, reservations. And on top of that, wonderfully so, he participates in the intellectual life of this seminar. So that's why it's so great that we can feature him tonight while the rest of us try to keep the rest going. And so we're going to turn the steering wheel over to Peter. I will just say that Roger and I just finished a seminar this afternoon focused on written cultures and epigraphy in early modern Europe. So tonight's topic is particularly relevant and interesting to me. And Peter's title inscriptions of sundry sorts, literacy, populism, and early American epigraphic culture. So let us thank Peter for all his accomplishments and for tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John, for that really lovely introduction. And thank you to John again, as well as to Jerry and to Zach in the SFO airport. It's been a real pleasure to be part of organizing all of these talks week to week. And it's an honor to be on this side of the table tonight. In 1717, Sir Isaac Newton purchased one of the most contested pieces of English property, the 41-meter maypole that had previously stood in the Strand in London. Since the early 16th century, there had been a maypole in the Strand, although the cycle of destroying and replacing maypoles in this very location had become repetitive. In 1618 and again in 1633, English monarchs issued declarations of sports, pieces of legislation that sought to reaffirm the legality of pagan merriments, including Maying and Morris dancing. The primary opponents of these legal declarations were Puritans, who in 1644, amid the English Revolution, destroyed the maypole in the Strand, calling it a godless, pagan shrine to the very royalist excess that they sought to supplant. Throughout the politically unstable second half of the 17th century, the ebbs and flows of royalist and republican power could, to some extent, be traced via conflicts over maypoles, maypoles in the Strand, a cycle of destruction and resurrection of this monument, whose presence and absence raised the question of whether English power would be defined by the nation's aristocratic, feudal roots or by a new regime of Puritan austerity. In 1713, the last maypole to ever occupy the Strand was removed once and for all and replaced by St. Mary le Strand Church, a transition commemorated by Alexander Pope in the Dunciad, where he writes, "The tall maypole once o'erlooked the Strand, but now so Anne and piety ordained, a church collects the saints of Drury Lane." And how was the 41-meter maypole repurposed? Sir Isaac Newton transported it to the Wanstead House outside of London to support Europe's largest telescope. I'm sorry, there's the Dunciad. It's said that one day around 1717, in the Wanstead House, an anonymous poem was found affixed to the maypole. "Once I adorned the Strand, but now have found my way to pound on Baron Newton's land, where my aspiring head aloft is reared to observe the motions of the ethereal lord. Here sometimes raised a machine by my side, through which is seen the sparkling milky tide. Here oft I'm scented with balmy dew, a pleasant blessing which the Strand ne'er knew. There stood I only to receive abuse, but here converted to a nobler use, so that with me all passengers will say, I'm better far than when the pole of May." So the anonymous poet who attached these sardonic verses to the maypole saw the monument as a site on which to stage a debate between the antiquated use of the maypole for pagan rural sports and a Whiggish progress narrative represented by the maypole's new purpose as a technology to support scientific discovery. This poet's practice of treating the maypole as a surface on which to affix polemical verse may seem strange, but it is worth noting that almost a century earlier, an equally contested maypole had served as a similar monument on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1624, Thomas Morton, an Anglican royalist who had co-authored James I's Declaration of Sports, began his own trading venture around Massachusetts Bay, first on behalf of a royal trading company, but ultimately in service of his own personal economic goals. He soon sought to found a new colony that would rival the colonial authority of the Pilgrims at Plymouth and the Puritans at Massachusetts Bay, a population of radical Protestants that Morton would deem the separatists. Morton believed that the separatists, in their violence toward indigenous people whom they encountered, were not only extremely cruel, but also missed the opportunity to welcome English settlers and indigenous people alike into a true New England. As Peter Mancall has noted, Morton wanted the region we call New England to be truly that, a New England, a second chance at a society that in Europe had fallen to its own moral decay, anti-intellectualism, schismatic religious infighting, and indifference to its own noble heritage. As a disgruntled and displaced aristocrat, Morton boasted that his own American colony, which he would call Marymount, would become a raucous, egalitarian alternative to the violence and austerity that he saw at Plymouth. In violation of colonial law, he would trade arms and booze to his Native American trading partners, who likely included Wampanoag, Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Niantic, Pequot Mohegan, and Abenaki people. And outside of Boston, he would seek to model performative egalitarianism built on the old customs of idyllic country houses by inviting elite colonists, transported white servants, and indigenous people alike to participate in rural sports. Iconically, in 1628, Morton erected an 80-foot maypole in Marymount, likely America's first maypole, where a motley crew of Algonquin people and white settlers engaged in old world sports and festivities as if to theatrically and communally rebel against Puritan asceticism. Within a year, the Puritans then formed a militia that destroyed Morton's maypole and deported him back to England. So, in the New English Canon, which is Morton's 1637 account of his time in New England, the failed colonist writes that he too had once affixed a poem to his maypole. Morton's affixed poem, which you can see on the screen, was a near impenetrable hodgepodge of classical and biblical allusions, which imagines the Greek king Oedipus solving a riddle in which mythological figures like the sea monster Scylla and Charybdis, Greek gods like Triton, and even biblical figures like Samson and Job appear together in an erotically charged scene that ends in the divine declaration of the 1st of May as May Day. Unlike the poem that would later be affixed to Newton's maypole, the poem Rise Oedipus seeks to bewilder its readers. But both of the maypoles that we have seen, in their own way, stage a conflict between a nostalgia for Old English customs and the desire to leave those customs behind in service of ostensibly progressive social arrangements. The poem on Newton's maypole does so explicitly by declaring the superiority of telescopes over maypoles. Rise Oedipus, Morton's poem, takes a more circuitous route to its polemic. Morton's impenetrable poem was originally written in manuscript and affixed to the maypole in New England, but in his 1637 book, The New English Canon, Morton transcribes Rise Oedipus and narrates the circumstances around it. Morton mocks the Puritans and Pilgrims' failure to understand the poem's dense erudition. The poem, Morton writes, quote, being enigmatically composed, puzzled the separatists most pitifully to expound it. The riddle, for want of Oedipus, they, the separatists, could not expound, end quote. According to the New English Canon, Morton affixed many such manuscript poems to the maypole over time, many of which are transcribed in his 1637 book, and the classicist feats of each of these manuscript poems further displayed the gap that Morton perceived between his own erudition and the separatists' simple minds. Matt Cohen has persuasively argued that we should read Morton's maypole as a publishing venue or, quote, a sophisticated communication tool with poems tacked on for communal reading in a public place, in a manner meant to intentionally stigmatize Puritan reading practices in favor of Morton's own. So why, you might wonder, in such a high-stakes fight over the future of colonial governance in New England, should Morton have given so much energy to writing and affixing poems onto this monument? In fact, this question of the written word has high stakes in Morton's own political position, as his work as a missionary and a colonist was largely characterized by his own promotion of alphabetic literacy and his insistence on the use of the Book of Common Prayer, which he saw as both oppositional to and more just than Puritans' primarily rhetorical methods of converting indigenous people through preaching. This was largely a theological debate between an Anglican like Morton's preference for the Book of Common Prayer versus dissenters who would categorically reject the prayer book. But the status of the text in general, of written words, in books, in manuscripts affixed to monuments, seems to have been an obsession of Morton's that extended beyond debates about the best ways to pray. Namely, Morton believed that the material text was a necessary centerpiece of an egalitarian society. He associated the especially cruel and exploitative colonial practices of the separatists with their perceived indifference to books and indifference to teaching alphabetic literacy as a missionary tactic, as Morton believed that primarily oral means of mass conversion would be more hierarchical and manipulative. Meanwhile, to flaunt his own self proclaimed superior missionary agenda rooted in the book, Morton filled Marymount with words on every surface, and he filled his own writing in the New English Canon with feats of literate erudition. Morton is representative of a trend in early America of settlers who sought to rebel against mainstream colonial authorities through wars of words, by which I don't just mean debate via rhetoric in the public sphere or even political debate in print culture, but rather a culture of affixed and inscribed words on doors and walls and monuments and maypoles. In places where this rebellious epigraphic culture thrived, participants often expressed their own counterintuitive and at times counter-hegemonic colonial visions by publicly flaunting their superior literacy. So this presentation will spend time discussing two such figures, Thomas Morton of New England around the 1620s and 30s, and then Francis Daniel Pastorius in Pennsylvania in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Both of these figures created major literary intellectual accounts of living and learning in the colonies, the New English Canon for Morton, and then Pastorius's massive commonplace book, The Beehive, which you can see in front of you. And through case studies from both of these texts, I want to observe a few patterns in the counter-hegemonic epigraphic culture of early America. First, that Morton and Pastorius located in both biblical and classical texts a means of articulating the merits of their own colonial authority. Two, that specifically Morton and Pastorius located in the classical ideal a self-proclaimed egalitarian ethic of colonial authority from which they could oppose policies that led to enslavement and exploitation. Third, that to prefigure the ideal social arrangements, these figures sought to promote mass alphabetic literacy and to create an epigraphic culture, a culture of letters in which public space would be a celebration of literacy and erudition. Fourth, that the epigraphic culture that Morton and Pastorius contributed to in early American public space also influenced the innovations in their own major literary works, such as innovations in page layout and in methods of commonplacing and extracting. And finally, that the larger contributions that these authors made to amplifying the status of English and English to books rendered early American epigraphy, commonplacing, and other practices of literary extraction into a site where the nature of English imperial power was debated during the first centuries of English empire building. By tracing these patterns in the contributions of two rebellious colonists, we can see that early American epigraphic culture had a meaningful influence on American book history. And by focusing on writers whose ideologies were marginal to mainstream colonial authority, we can see how innovations in epigraphy, on the page and on monuments alike, were heavily influenced by ongoing political battles to determine the centers and margins of colonial society. So let us return to Morton in New England circa 1628. We have seen now how his maypole itself becomes a communication technology to signal the social collective he seeks to create that would intentionally exclude the separatists, and that it's also, as Matt Cohen said, a publishing house, a literal site to post public literary meditations on Morton's utopian vision. For instance, when we consider that poem Rise Oedipus, the manuscript poem that Morton had posted on the maypole and then transcribed in full in New Canaan, we can see that its impenetrability and its comic density of allusions gives Morton easy ammunition with which to depict the separatists as illiterate fools who can hardly keep up with humanistic discourse, let alone run a colony. This subject of Morton's admonition of pilgrims and other Puritans represents a broader bibliophilic line of critique, expanding beyond the central debate around the use of common prayer in missionary activity with Native Americans. Morton issues the larger allegation that the separatists have hated him from day one, since he was a bibliophile and they were not. Since he brought books to America and they hated books. He further argued that because he had enjoyed an elite humanities education back in England, he held a key to ancient virtues that these ragtag separatists would never understand. Morton's 1637 book, The New English Canaan, contains elements of ethnography and natural history in its description of early 17th century New England, but its most animated portion is an autobiographical account of Morton's conflict with the separatists in the 1620s. The Anglican author describes his arrival in Plymouth, and the narrative immediately launches into staging a conflict over, quote, book learning in the Americas. Morton sailed to America first in 1622 for a brief visit, then in 1624 for a years-long stay on royal trading ships that also transported servants to the colonies. According to his account of one of these trips, Morton taught servants aboard the trading ship to read, and by the time this party arrived in New England, these servants had fully converted to Morton's bookish style of worship. I'll read the New English Canaan's narration of the first interaction between one of his servant followers and the pilgrim who greets them upon their arrival. So, quote, "Our master," says the servant, "reads the Bible and the word of God, and useth the book of common prayer. But this is not the means." This is now a pilgrim talking. "The answer is the means," say the pilgrims. "Cry, alas, poor souls, where is the means? You seem as if betrayed to be without the means. How can you be stayed from falling headlong to perdition? The book of common prayer," said they, "what poor thing is that for a man to read in a book? No, no, good sirs, would you were near us, you might receive comfort by instruction. Give me a man hath the gifts of the Spirit, not a book in his hand." So from the very first moment of Morton's arrival, as narrated in this book, the face-off between a royalist Anglican trading company and a pre-existing band of pilgrims is an argument about whether missionary work and conversion should take place with a book in the hand, or an aim toward mass alphabetic literacy. Morton turns this debate about missionary work into a motif that carries through the autobiographical narrative of New Canaan and centers on a retelling of the story of Jonah, the prophet who was sent to warn the Ninevites of their empire's imminent destruction. Already, the story of Jonah had become a popular allegory for England's earliest colonial ventures in the 17th century. In 1595, the English cartographer John Speed had produced a map of Canaan, which includes an illustration of the boat from which Jonah was overthrown and the large fish who ate him. Speed later printed this map in 1611 in the Theatre of Empire of Great Britain, a cartographic work dedicated to King James that celebrates and anticipates the growing reach of England's empire, thus imagining the colonies as a promised land to be settled by a chosen people of the English. In Morton's New English Canaan, another royalist work that imagined the Americas as a promised land to the English crown, the separatists are portrayed as mistaking their own role in the allegorical Jonah story. According to Morton, the separatists believe that they are Jonah, nobly preaching to a pagan population that must convert or face extirpation. But in fact, Morton calls this a misreading, as he instead casts the separatists as the cruel Ninevites, who must heed Morton's warning or else see England's nascent empire crumble at their feet. Indeed, the final words of the New English Canaan turn Morton's narration toward the separatists, addressing them in the second person. Quote, "Repent, you cruel separatists, repent. There is yet but 40 days. If Jove vouch to thunder, the charter and the kingdom of the separatists will fall asunder. Repent, you cruel schismatics, repent." End quote. So while establishing the separatists' false impression of themselves as virtuous prophets, Morton misses no opportunity to once again admonish their perceived disinterest in books. He once again criticizes them for relying on oral preaching in their missionary work, arguing that, quote, these illiterate people are so fantastical as to take Jonah's task upon them without sufficient warrant, end quote. But as stated earlier, this notion of the separatists as an illiterate and anti intellectual bunch extends from a mere debate about the Book of Common Prayer to a larger argument about bibliophilia versus bibliophobia in New England. At one point in his book, Morton goes so far as to argue that the separatists, quote, despise the Lady of Learning, vilifying the two universities with uncivil terms, accounting what is there obtained by study is but unnecessary learning, not considering that learning does enable men's minds to converse with the climates of a higher nature than is to be found within the habitation of a mole. End quote. In this sense, the New English Canon is not just a book about colonial conflict, it is a book about books. And as a work that helps us think about material texts in early America, New Canaan is also significant for several reasons. First, its articulation of the stakes of reading or not reading in the colonies. Second, the fact that it contains the transcriptions of some of the very earliest manuscript poetry written in English ever on this side of the Atlantic. But it's also worth noting that New Canaan is an innovative material text in and of itself, whose management of the space of the page mimics the world of words that Morton sought to create in New England. One of the especially notable qualities of New Canaan is Morton's heavy use of marginalia. Matt Cohen has argued that Morton's marginalia, quote, established the page as a highly politicized zone in which readers expect to find evidence of a writer's opinion, end quote. And I want to take that argument a step further by suggesting that Morton's management of the space of the page, as evidenced by his marginalia, makes fluid the interplay between early American epigraphic culture and the book. Morton uses the margins of his book to quite literally signpost his arguments about the separatists' alleged illiteracy. When Morton stages the conflict over book learning between the Anglican servant and the Puritan pilgrim, he includes the marginal note, quote, book learning despised. And when he describes the separatists' ultimate plot to deport him back to England, Morton calls the separatists, quote, elephants of wit in the main text, and then accompanies that admonishment with an esoteric reference to the Greek philosopher Epictetus in the margin. These marginal notes, in a sense, do the reader's work for them, as Morton promises that he's filling in the blanks with judgmental notes that readers would otherwise jot down themselves. In this sense, this marginalia is seductive. Morton's notes effectively compliment the reader of New Canaan for being so erudite that he can follow along with Morton's allusions, unlike the pilgrim, who these margins remind us would never be reading this book to begin with. Like the impenetrable poem pasted on the maypole, these marginal notes serve to make those who follow along with Morton's flights of fancy feel included on the basis of high literacy, while laughing along with him at the separatists. Believing that textuality does the work of invoking these feelings in readers, Morton turned the surfaces and monuments of New England, as well as the pages of his books, into places to post his verses and polemics to rile up a populist rebellion. Now, let me make an important note about Morton's self-perception. Although it's easy to feel seduced by Morton's dichotomy of erudite noblemen versus illiterate separatists, this binary is complicated by the realities of early American knowledge production. The Puritans of New England, in fact, had their own well-developed writings on classical knowledge. And on the other hand, Morton's classical allusions are full of errors of attribution, misquotes, misreadings, and bad translations. In a recent monograph on classical reception in early New England, the classicist David Luffer meticulously traces such errors in Morton's allusions and makes persuasive arguments about how these errors can help us determine the actual books that Morton possessed and referred to when copying classical extracts into his New English canon. Luffer largely treats this study as a dismissal of the pretentious Morton, but I want to make a more positive argument about the affordances of reconstructing the Anglican bibliophile's bookshelf. Lufer shows us that it's likely, for instance, that the new Canaan author possessed a copy of the 1578 English translation of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, from which Morton borrowed a marginal reference to Cicero in English, and that it was likely that Morton consulted a 1567 English translation of a French translation of a work by Epictetus, and also possibly Abraham Fleming's 1576 English translation of the works of the Roman author Elian, and almost certainly George Turberville's 1567 translation of Ovid's Heroides. For Lufer, Morton's heavy reliance on translation, or at other times translations of translations, and often with some errors made along the way, weakens the Anglican author's claims to intellectual superiority over his adversaries. But I see Morton's bookshelf of English and Englished books in the colonies as representing a more interesting facet of early American book collecting. That the presence of English literature and English translations of classics became, for American book collectors, a means of realizing the westward movement of empire. Hearing the voices of figures like Cicero in the English idiom allowed early colonial readers to bridge ancient virtue and contemporary governance. So, this model of anglicized classicism was both backward and forward looking. The goal was to derive energy from past empires, but in the tongue of the empire to come. So we find in Morton a radical alternative to the Puritans' colonial vision for New England, one which is grounded in a celebration of the text, epigraphy, book collecting, fixations on alphabetic literacy. This celebration of the material text for Morton enables an alternative colonial vision that is at once ostensibly egalitarian and bullish about England's forthcoming imperial expansion. Encountering Morton's fixations on various textualities and their capacity to articulate a radical colonial vision prompted me to return to a slightly later book that is perhaps the most comprehensive account of epigraphic culture, English book collecting, and radical colonial world building in the 17th century. That is my old ball and chain, Daniel Pastorius' The Beehive. So, for those who don't know, Pastorius was a German pietist attorney with an affinity for English Quakerism, who moved from Germany to Pennsylvania in 1683 and negotiated with William Penn to legally secure 15,000 acres of land in the forthcoming Pennsylvania colony, specifically for German dissenters, thus founding Germantown, Pennsylvania. Pastorius went on to work as an educator, school headmaster, treasurer, and sheriff, though he spent the last 2 decades of his life from about 1696 to 1719 in a state of retirement, gardening, and producing a 1,000-page commonplace book that sits in front of you. Although Pastorius was a German migrant whose work as a colonial administrator was primarily in service to German and Dutch folks, his massive manuscript commonplace book, The Beehive, is written largely in English. It's an astonishing display of Pastorius's extremely wide library, but it is especially a celebration of English books. Like Morton, Pastorius was a colonist who was simultaneously critical of the social arrangements he left behind in Europe and also critical of exploitative and dispossessive practices in the colonies themselves. Pastorius famously is often considered the first American abolitionist author, as he penned the 1688 Germantown Quaker petition against slavery. And also, like Morton, he sought to express his social critiques by constructing a world of extracts and epigraphs, on pages, but also out in the world, based on his belief that the key to the world he wanted to build was in the books he read and in other texts. So, to walk you through a few of the relevant parts of the massive tome of the Beehive, I will start by discussing Pastorius's own obsession with epigraphs, and then some of the other ways that he incorporated his book learning into public debate, public space, and then in retirement, the pages of his manuscript commonplace book. So the Beehive is divided into sections with different organizing principles for extracts and titles: inscriptions, epitaphs, proverbs, poetry, biblical and other theological citations, quotations from various ancient and contemporary figures, a list of books that Pastorius read or knew, often divided into books by Quakers and books by non-Quakers, notes on science, useful herbs and other plants, and then a far-reaching encyclopedia with over 4,000 entries. Some of these sections draw knowledge from books that Pastorius collected or borrowed during his later life in America, but others pull from his early life in Germany or his travels around Europe. Prior to coming to Pennsylvania, Pastorius was the tutor of a nobleman with whom he toured Europe, and one section of the Beehive claims to record epigraphs that Pastorius had seen on a variety of monuments during these travels. So this section is given a sort of subtitle, Inscriptions of Sundry Sorts, and yet most of them in Latin words. He begins the section with a meditation on sundials, one of the surfaces on which he claims to have seen many epigraphs abroad. He transcribes some of the inscriptions he allegedly saw on sundials throughout Europe, all in Latin, but which I've translated into English, sort of. He claims to have seen a sundial with an epigraph saying, quote, "Our days on earth are as a shadow that passeth away and continueth not." So that's pulling it from First Chronicles 29, "Our days on earth are as a shadow." From Psalm 144, "Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow." And the book of Job, "He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also like a shadow and continueth not." He also saw a sundial inscribed with the question, "What kind of shade do those who do not fear in the face of the Lord pass through?" A question which he relates to Ecclesiastes 8:13, "But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God." He also writes a lengthy list of epigraphs he witnessed on clocks in Europe. Again, these are translations, including one that said, quote, "I measure time with human effort," one that said, "The most precious thing is time," and one saying, "Eternity depends on this moment." It is noteworthy that Pastorius begins his lengthy account of epigraphs by presenting these various timekeeping devices as communication technologies that are inscribed with messages about temporality, messages that Pastorius deems useful to his didactic intellectual project on the virtue of retirement in a new colonial setting. These inscriptions on clocks and sundials remind Pastorius, and therefore his reader, of the cyclical nature of time and the importance of maintaining faith and virtue as time barrels forward. This is a broader theme that Pastorius pulls from many texts that he discusses in the Beehive. In fact, this theme relates to a problem that he illustrates early in the Beehive when he copies over an image of a wheel from a 1583 history of the Dutch Revolt by Austrian historian Michael Eitzinger. According to this wheel, quote, "All empires, kingdoms, and provinces begin in a state of poverty, which begets lowliness but enables peace. However, once a state of peace enables traffic or trade to produce wealth, the society becomes prideful and in turn enters a state of war. War then leads the wheel back to start over with poverty, and it all happens again." So it's unsurprising that Pastorius views biblical wisdom literature as a source of knowledge with which to imagine how the empire in which he finds himself a migrant resident can break that cycle and achieve a different fate. Before writing The Beehive, Pastorius wrote many works more plainly detailing the European and colonial social arrangements that he sought to leave behind, and we know from those writings that he, like Thomas Morton, believed primarily that a good life and a healthy society would emerge from people striking a healthy balance between personal, solitary study of the Bible and public works for the good of a community. Pastorius warned against the European intellectual and scholarly practices that occluded that lifestyle. His preface to his 1700 geographical description of Pennsylvania decries the babbling and ostentation of frivolous worldly wisdom that he encountered in mainland European universities during his travels throughout the continent as well as during his own education. And he especially criticizes young German nobles who, quote, "spent a large portion of their German patrimony on the useless frivolities of the world, dedicating no thought to the love of God and to the wisdom of an imitation of Christ, well pleasing in the sight of the Lord." These are denigrations of young people who, like Pastorius, were likely educated in the gymnasium, a system of secondary education that prioritized the study of classics and of both ancient and modern languages. Part of the lawyer's concern about elite German education was what he considered a misuse of classical knowledge, such as the use of an Aristotelian lens to study the Bible. In short, Pastorius associated with his native country a self-serving perversion of classical education and taste, a perversion that cuts people off from their Christian duties. So for Pastorius, what good was classical knowledge if it could so easily corrupt? In a manner similar to Morton, Pastorius saw erudition as a virtue and saw classical texts as sources of knowledge and energy for individual readers and larger imperial actors alike, so long as the messages of those classical texts would not lead people to diminish the central importance of developing their own readerly relationship to Scripture. In some of the occasional verses that Pastorius wrote throughout the Beehive, he likened this method of engaging with heterodox sources toward positive ends to the work of the bee, who might land on many flowers and beyond the boundaries of others' properties, but who will only gather honey, the best material, from each of them. In turn, Pastorius's extraction and transcription of all sorts of texts, whether in epigraphs or in his commonplace book, became his method of deriving only honey. The Beehive is the primary compendium of Pastorius's favorite extracts. However, in various works of colonial promotional literature that he also wrote, the German migrant describes the other epigraphs and inscriptions around New England. Like Morton, whose maypole was both a communication technology and a publishing house, Pastorius saw colonial public space and the private notebook as joined as a continuous surface for extraction and commonplacing. Above the doorway to his first house in Germantown, Pastorius wrote in Latin, Parva domus, sed amica bonus, procul este profani. I do not know Latin, though. It's a pure reading. But meaning, a small house, but a friend to the good, stay away, ye profane. This is paraphrased from a line in Virgil's Aeneid from the moment when Aeneas finds the entrance into the underworld. Of course, recontextualizing a quotation about entering the underworld for to the entrance of Pastorius's own home was mostly a snobby joke on Pastorius's part. But according to one of Pastorius's narratives of his life in Pennsylvania, William Penn earned his stamp of approval when the English Quaker looked at Pastorius's doorway and saw and recognized the allusion in the inscription. Like Morton's Rise Oedipus poem affixed to the maypole, Pastorius's inscription above his door becomes a tool to determine who his allies were in his project of erudite colony building. And this also, by being in the doorway of his home, I think makes us think about domesticity in its multiple definitions. But what is notable about both Morton and Pastorius is that their ostensibly snobbish tendencies to go for opaque, at times esoteric classical references doesn't mean that either defines the outgroup, simply as people who lack the elite humanities educations of these two European barristers. Rather, as we saw with Morton, these figures advance a populist approach to literacy, believing that it is the colonial administrator's job to promote alphabetic literacy, and also that with literacy comes a sort of collective power against manipulative colonial authorities with bad intentions. For Morton, this obviously pertained primarily to teaching English reading to indentured servants and to indigenous people for the purposes of Anglican worship. Pastorius, however, focused more on persuading German and Dutch migrants in Pennsylvania to learn English. Pastorius's interest in the literacy and English education of Dutch and German migrants has a few purposes. First, Pastorius sought to promote assimilation among migrants as part of his lifelong effort to persuade the English crown to make German and Dutch settlers naturalized citizens of the empire. But Pastorius's investment in the English language, in the learning of English, seems to run deeper. He dedicates the Beehive to his sons, and in a few moments, he flags that he hopes the commonplace book will help them perfect their English, and that he's also open to others using the book for their same purposes. On one of the title pages, there's many title pages in the Beehive, Pastorius writes that he composed this commonplace book, quote, for the better learning of the English, so that my two sons might hereafter have some of their father's steps, thereby to be guided with the same diligence and assiduity of picking the best out of good writings. He He hoped that they would learn from his writings and methodologies, both to gain scholarly skills and knowledge in the absence of the European humanistic education, and to gain an appreciation of great English writers. Morton writes, "Seeing it is the largest of my manuscripts, which I, in my riper years, did gather out of excellent English authors, my desire, last will, and testament is that my two sons, John Samuel and Henry Pastorius, shall have my writings to themselves and their heirs forever." Pastorius's deeper investment in the teaching and learning of English seems to more broadly mark a prescient idea he had, communicated still in the English Empire's nascent years, that someday English would be the lingua franca, or that global movements would unify around the English language. Pastorius was a populist, a universalist, an abolitionist, and a utopian planner, and he envisioned a world in which the movements to accomplish his lofty goals would be diverse but unified in a literate, erudite, English-speaking body. His bullish support for the expansion of English leads him to some almost comical cheerleading. One of Pastorius's most unforgivable epigraphic habits was borrowing other people's books, then writing notes inside of those friends' books before returning them, and then copying down those notes that he had written into the beehive. So when he borrowed a friend's, Samuel Humphreys, a copy of the posthumous works of the 17th century English poet Abraham Cowley, he returned that friend's copy with a handwritten poem somewhere on the title pages in praise of Cowley, perhaps we should say too strongly complimentary. I'll read from it. "Praise Virgil and Horatium, then Lucan, Catul, Juvenal, and him whom we the long nose call, our Cowley does outrhyme them all." Did Pastorius really think that a minor poet of the English Revolution was a greater bard than Horace or Virgil? Likely not. But when this German migrant calls the English poet our Cowley, this lumps Pastorius into a collective our. In turn, Pastorius implicitly calls himself a British subject and declares that English national poets are outrhyming the greatest writers of ancient empires. Such playful meditations on classical legacies, English writing, and cultures of reading are characteristic of Pastorius's and also Morton's inventive textual practices. Both of these figures were utopian, perhaps even progressive voices in a contested Atlantic world. Today, we might think of them as marginal to the stories of how America progressed, but their contributions to epigraphy, manuscript culture, and book history should hardly be ignored. Their heterodox, counterintuitive, and in turn counter-hegemonic textual practices leave open insurgent possibilities for the future of English and American literary production, for the making of new books, and for the making of new worlds. Thank you.
Okay. Take a breath after all that erudition while Peter resets us here. Thank you very much, Peter, on all those fronts. And Liliana has her first question prepared.
It's not prepared, but first of all, thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful talk. When I write a note of a citation from classics or a poem and I fix it at a door or wall, let's leave out the maypole for a moment because that's a political issue, then I expect a certain reaction. It's a declaration of my erudition, as you have said about Morton and Pastorius. It's a hint toward segregation. It's me, the others are different.
Yeah.
And it's also a way of reading that from the onset resembles a little bit the readings of books.
Yes.
So it's the readings of books put on the wall that is then returned. But let's for a moment imagine that there is a competition for the notes, that somebody might want to put up a note as an advertisement or a wanted sign or some sort of text that is not a declaration of erudition, segregation, and so on, but maybe a call for action. slave escaped, wanted something, and so on. So the way of affixing it is not necessarily the way of reading in books.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you can say something about the, let's call it slippage, or the influence, or maybe the way you might normally, whatever this is, read notes that now became literary notes that resemble the book, rather than start with a literary book, note that is already a little bit like reading the book. Is that
Could you rephrase the
Hello.
last moment, the question?
right?
Yeah.
The reader who reads a wanted note, is not reading it as a declaration of erudition or segregation, it's a call to action.
Yes.
So you do public notices because you want something. Now, the gesture of all of this is the same, except it does something different. If you affix it to the public, but now you don't use the public to look for the escaped slave, but you want the public to see how erudite it is.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether something of that other way of calling attention via note affixing is entering the perception of what a literary text or book is.
I see. So you mean the way in which readers are primed to see an affixed text is a call to action rather than a place to
That's
like
right.
meditate on erudition might then change reading practices in the other direction. Yeah.
Difficult.
Yes, I think that makes, that makes sense to me because I think for the figures I'm talking about, the practices of reading itself is, I think, instrumentalized. I think as much as Morton and Pastorius are both figures who represent a kind of like, or at least self-represent as a kind of like pastoral retirement in which they're like, over a desk reading all of the time. I think that for both of these figures, they were really fixated on the very careful dance between the virtues of a retirement that would be very readerly and lead you to spend a lot of time meditating over texts versus the decision, the sort of, like Cicero-like decision to never fully retire, to imagine that retirement is still like, a place of potential where you can be called to action at any moment. So I think there is something about, I think that there's something about the way that, that they're asking readers to make a large commitment to the book in both of their sort of ideas of what literacy, mass literacy will look like, but in a way that's like always keeps them on their toes. And also that, but you were going to follow up, sorry.
Well, it's not just a question of commitment and the stuff here, but it's you read differently.
Yes.
A reader who sees a wanted sign is saying, "Oh my God, wanted! Let me look where it is
Yeah.
and do something." So if you do, let's say, Jonah up there on such a sign, you look for Jonah.
Yes.
Not take it as a biblical quote. So I wonder whether one has another attitude towards reading that is now via these notes entering the book content.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I often wonder about, and which we don't really have evidence of, but is, what was the kind of like temporality of the reading practices that contributed to the beehive or contributed to like the kinds of really frantic extracting? Because one thing that we do know about both Pastorius and Morton is that they both owned a lot of books, but they also transcribed a lot from books they did not own. I mean, as I mentioned, Pastorius was always borrowing books and then ruining them with his own pen. But like, I think that there is, in that way, and in that kind of standard of like the bee going flower to flower, an idea that reading isn't always something you luxuriate in, but rather something which you do with the intention of picking something out for a very specific and actionable purpose. And I think something like the little extracts that we get in the beehive, even something like the little ways that Morton, throws quotes into margins and things like that, seem to make a very clear insistence, like we're here to, do something about what this text is meant to tell you to do. It can be almost a little bit of a fortune cookie as well as like, as well as a gesture toward the bigger book.
So, the risk of going out of order, I'm going to go right to the chat, and it will change us a little bit on topic, off to a different topic. But Kelly Wisecup, hi Kelly, long time no see, has posed a question in the chat, and we'll do that one, and then we'll swing back inside. Thanks for this talk, Peter. I was wondering about how you see the work of Morton and Pastorius, their interest in mass literacy, especially in relation to or not another big publication event, the translation and printing of the Bible in Wampanoag in the 1660s. I'm especially interested in whether your argument is suggesting that we need to rethink relations between people like Morton and those like John Eliot.
Thank you. I haven't thought about Morton and John Eliot in like the sense of, like foils or participating in some way in the same project. I think that for me though, like the where I do see there being something very specific about Morton's like simultaneously like very condescending, but then also like strangely populist commitment to like mass literacy in English, to the English Book of Common Prayer, to all of that, is it seems to like insist on not just alphabetic literacy, but also language learning as a kind of way of acquiring a shared heritage between settlers and indigenous people, which he sees as liberatory. So, of course, everything about this is like 10 layers deep. But one of the very strange parts of the beginning of New English Canaan, which the first third of it is like Morton's really affectionate like ethnography of indigenous people, is that he makes this really surprising series of claims about observations around Algonquin languages, in which he sees there being like Greek and Roman roots. So he says, for instance, the naming of places like Mattapan have that root Pan and must mean that people worshipped the god Pan. And he also is very committed to the notion of a Romano-British heritage, meaning an idea that by like going to Morris dancing, going to the maypole, going to these kinds of ancient English rites, that he's pulling out a sort of like old ethnic heritage that he relates to and that he thinks the Puritans have left behind at the expense of a healthy society. And so in a way, like part of, I think, the effort to not even focus on difference, but rather do these really elaborate, like playful efforts to imagine literacy and language learning as a means of identifying a sort of like ruckus universality or something like that seemed to Morton to be a claim that we're all participating in this kind of true ideal, which is found in not in contemporary colonial society, but in a sort of ancient Englishness that only English nobles and indigenous people seem to understand, and which skips right over the separatists. So that seems to be the polemic, which I think is very different from the missionary work of someone like John Eliot, and which makes, I think, a very a both radical and very troubling claim about what the purpose of his work is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about language and Morton. Yeah. So, all right. Ariel, George, and we'll move it from there.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much. This was such a fantastic talk. This is kind of a unfair or sort of like outside the bounds of the scope of your project, but I guess I'm just wondering, and what this talk made me think of, especially the part on Morton, is what we can sort of extract from this or take from this about contemporary discourses of anti-intellectualism, the role of public schools in America. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were about that as you were reading this. The Morton discourses with the separatists was really kind of funny and sounded, at least from his perspective, kind of familiar, I think. So yeah.
That's a funny question. I like it. I mean, I think that one of the essays that, and I'm gonna talk about an essay really vaguely that I neither remember the title nor author of, but I can tell you the source. In the Postcolonial Studies and Beyond book that Anya and Suvir co-edited, and Jed and some other people co-edited, there is this essay that has always struck me as really meaningful, which is an essay that asks us to revise, to an extent, our understanding of the teaching of Shakespeare and other kind of works of like high English literary authority in colonial and post-colonial English speaking countries. As you know, historically, of course, the discourse has largely been that that is a sort of ideological state apparatus, that's a means of asserting English authority, which I think is, of course, true. But there's an essay in that volume that asks us in light of a more sort of globalized economy and in light of global inequity, the way in which the sort of social justice driven decision not to teach those texts or to kind of decide who reads and who doesn't read like the works that deliver high literary authority can actually become itself a technology of reaffirming a sort of inequality. That's something that I think does affect my own, does influence my own thought about the discourse around whether the teaching of certain canonical texts is elitist or can be counter-elitist, which, I tend to come on the side that there is a virtue in us all reading those texts everywhere. But one which should be, I think, articulated in light of the critiques that led us to become skeptical of that. So that's something which I think there can be potentially energy derived from Morton. I think he's an example of someone who sees, because I think one of the things I find interesting about both Morton and Pastorius is they're both people who see high erudition as something that is exclusionary and does that work of segregation, as Liliana was saying, but not on the basis of class or the basis of education, but rather the basis of a certain dedication to a project that they want to democratize. And there's something I do find kind of beautiful about that.
Peter, this was so much fun. Thank you. I found myself thinking a lot about the kind of debates in the latter part of the 16th century about that elevation of English or the vernacular, the language capable of kind of bearing the burden of empire. And I think something I really appreciated is you've relocated a huge chunk of that conversation away from London or England or Europe and kind of place it firmly in this early colonial moment. I think a question I have is, where does the kind of expounding of the value of classical literacy butt into the kind of expansion of English vernacular output? And to what extent are these writers or thinkers or people grappling with those questions themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because one of the things that I think is exceptional about the Beehive in particular is that it takes a sort of commonplace method that has previously existed primarily to dignify classical texts and all of a sudden turns them on very contemporary English literature, like a lot of poetry of the English Revolution. I mentioned Cowley. He also calls Edmund Waller England's Virgil. He's very free with that kind of complimenting. But what the Beehive kind of does in an almost linear way is it goes from expounding early on our kind of traditional on our kind of traditional idea of classical knowledge to showing us or demonstrating those same techniques onto English literature. As far as what kind of hierarchy that creates, or what it means to be a work that advances both of those things. I mean, I go back to Pastorius's argument about the way in which classical learning has been kind of perverted in the European academy. His argument that it's become that I think that because I see Pastorius as someone who sees a fundamental virtue in classical learning and the reading of contemporary literature, but one from which the study of the Bible needs to be the one series, needs to be done in its own realm. And I think that that's I think that he's always afraid of the way in which other reading methods become methods to read the Bible and therefore pervert our faith or classicize it in some kind of overly free-flowing way. And I think that what that does is it gives a place to both the virtue of classical learning and of course Bible reading, and then finally to learning about contemporary society through the reading of contemporary English literature. But it does so, I think, without insisting on the hierarchy that of course classical learning is better, it says like it can be just as cheap and perverse, and needs to be managed the same way. But once you see classical learning and classical education not as something to be put on a pedestal, but rather as something that needs to be managed very carefully, then what you're doing is just developing pedagogical and readerly methods that can be applied much more widely without an idea of like what literature counts and what doesn't. So that's obviously I'm doing it.
Yeah.
But Lily, repeat
Oh,
it.
go ahead. Yeah.
Peter, this was a lot of fun. I'm just hoping that you can fill in some gaps in my knowledge about the separatists.
Mhm.
So my question is, what are the reasons why a person would not want to read? Like, do we believe Morton's account of the separatists as like being actively anti-literate? Or is this a matter of like, we don't have books, we don't particularly see how useful they are? Or is this like a matter of like religious stakes of like the text as being like an offensive mediation between you and God?
Thank you. It's funny because like his account of separatist illiteracy, at least when talking about the kind of elite level, is like totally wrong. I mean, William
Yeah,
Bradford,
exactly. We
who's
have
his
to-
William
It's
Bradford,
nonsense.
yes, William Bradford, who's like his primary adversary, the like early colonial governor of Plymouth, is one of the great classicists of early America. He like taught himself Hebrew just because he wanted to be able to read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. So this whole notion of illiteracy, I think, is really a sort of creative writing exercise that builds solely from the actual, like I think the more historically accurate debate, which is between the reading of the Book of Common Prayer versus what he perceives as a less literacy focused means of missionary work. But I think the way in which he takes that conflict and then, because that's when he says book learning despised in that marginal note, that's what he's talking about. But then when he uses that to expand and say, like, they also hate the classics, they also hate, just reading itself, they are illiterate. I think that's purely saying, like, here's something true, and here's like a fun rhetorical game that we can play. That's one of the reasons why I'm not super persuaded by the claim that Morton's own gaps in classical knowledge make him less legitimate or less important to read, as David Lufer has suggested, because I think like it's already so made up the way in which he's like asserting himself into this debate that I think the idea that someone who's like obsessed with maypoles would be kind of playing with us in this way is entirely likely.
Please, so many questions. Then go ahead and then Jerry. Yeah, and then Peter. Sorry.
And Molly.
Thank you so much for this talk, Peter. I just have a probably rather simple question for you. If Thomas Morton was so hated, who would even publish his extremely adversarial book? Like, what was the publishing ecosystem that supported his work at that time?
Yeah, it was actually published in Amsterdam. So it was published by a publisher, Jan Frederik Stam, who was a Dutch publisher, but so it was certainly never, I don't think he even tried to have it published. He may have tried, because he wrote the first two books, which are the ethnography of indigenous people and then a sort of like complementary natural history of the abundance of American land. And he wrote those two books, and then I think in the early 1630s tried to get them published in England, and they weren't. And then he got really mad and wrote this very adversarial third book, which has like all the sort of anger toward the separatists mostly contained in it. And then it was published in Amsterdam. But what's strange about this particular publisher in Amsterdam publishing this work is that this was actually the publisher that was most invested in publishing radical English writing that couldn't find a publishing house in England. But most of that writing was quite adversarial to Morton's own position. So Morton would later, by the time New Canaan was published, he was back in England, deported, and would soon be allying with the royalist cause in the civil wars. And he also, was himself kind of a radical Protestant, but he was an Anglican and he hated the dissenters. And yet this Dutch publisher was known to be like the one you go to when you can't get your work published in England, because they were willing to publish dissenter literature that opposed the crown. So it was this kind of odd way in which, yes, he went to that. And that's why I see him as this like separatist among separatists, which is a term he uses and that I'm currently putting in the title of my diss, because he's both really like outside of anyone's authority, but doing so in a way that's just as angry with like the radicals as it is with the traditionalists.
Yeah, but yeah, and he really is outside of everybody, which sort of undermine like, who's he arguing? There's no one to argue
Right,
with
he's a
except
little
himself in
man on
some
his
way.
own, yeah.
Let's get Peter and then Jerry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This was amazing. I have a question that follows from Kelly's inquiry to you about John Eliot. I would just encourage you to think through that comparison more, because the way that you're talking about English as a potentially, English language as a potentially kind of leveling, inclusive, practice, the teaching of English language, and viewing the Eliot Bibles in contrast to that, I think is incredibly provocative, and really it's actually congruent with the way that people now conceive of the praying towns and the practices related to the praying towns as being kind of exclusionary. And thinking about the Eliot Bible as a way of kind of keeping these people over there by giving them the Bible in their own language. Is just fascinating. It fits in really well with the way that a lot of other literature is framing praying towns right now. So I think you could make a really interesting contribution there.
And remember that, I mean, there was, I think through the 17th century, a debate about Eliot's practices, like, and there was knowledge in New England of the Spanish debate too, you know, that the old problem, do we learn their languages or should they learn ours? So there was no third edition of the Eliot Bible because people like Cotton Mather saw it as a bad move to do all this translation rather than a different kind of conversion practice, which would be Anglo-based. But go ahead, Peter.
No, and that's exactly right. So I just have a quick question for you, kind of unrelated, following on what you said about Bradford. I wonder if you're giving Bradford too much credit and kind of discrediting Morton's critique too thoroughly, because if you look at the table of Hebrew words that's in a Plymouth Plantation, it's incredibly basic, right? I mean, he's got the word for like dog in Hebrew, and it's not clear to me that he actually has much proficiency with Hebrew. And I wonder, I think a lot of historians, because very few of us know any Hebrew, have kind of been very generous in depicting Bradford as a, you know, really erudite guy. And I just wonder if it would be interesting to inquire whether Morton was actually kind of, if he was onto something in calling these people out for having these pretensions of being Hebrew scholars when actually they really didn't know much at all.
Nice.
Thank you. I like that a lot. I mean, I really appreciate both of what you said, and I'm very happy that the next time I'll be speaking about Morton will be at, I think, the conference you're organizing. So thank you for both of those provocations. You know, I am especially, I think for now I'll just, I in anticipation of more research on both of those things, I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Thank you. At long last.
Wonderful. I guess I'm looping back to some of, you know, the earlier questions and thinking again about the actual audience for these books and how they were read by who. And you know, we know from what Pastorius says that it's for his sons and he wants to keep it in the family. And you know, there's maybe a paradox there that he's passing it down to the family, but you said he's really bringing in a lot of contemporary materials. So one might wonder about the potential datedness of what he's passing on to his children and grandchildren and so forth. I'm really more puzzled about Morton and who he actually is writing for and who is actually reading the book. You know, he's, as you framed it so wonderfully, I mean, he's kind of constructing the colony, he's constructing the colonists. But this doesn't seem to be written for those people to whom he is bringing literacy.
And it's 15 years after the
And
fact.
Yes,
no
he's
longer
already
in North America. It's being published, as you say, in Amsterdam. So who is his audience at that point, and how is the book distributed? Do we have any indication that it comes to North America? I mean, it's the kind of description of, the land and the people that people here don't need to read.
Yeah.
Is it, do we have copies in American libraries? Is it entirely read in England? Do we have any sense of how rare a book it is?
Yeah. It is quite a rare book, especially it hardly made it to North America. The stories I know about it, about reading that book in North America, really start in the late 18th century. There's letters between like Jefferson and Adams, in which Adams claims to have gone to buy I forget which, but a different early American piece of kind of travel writing and promotional literature that had been bound with the New English Canon with it. And there's just this letter where Adams asks, like, do you know who this guy is? And interestingly, Quincy, Mass is really what now is Quincy, Mass is really the site of where this maypole was. There's a few, the probably most likely purpose for Morton's or likely intended audience for this book would have been Anglican potential settlers who Morton at this time genuinely hoped would come and outnumber and supplant the dissenting or Puritan colonial project. And that was in some ways a somewhat like realistic or meaty question to be asking at this point, because throughout the 1630s, especially in like legislation around the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there were moments in the English legislation where there were like true debates between which charters were going to go to like these more separatist groups versus how much authority was going to be granted to royal traders and royal authorities, especially like Ferdinand Gorges is one person who Morton was allied with, who ultimately got a charter to found something maybe like a softened version of what Morton wanted up in Maine. And actually Morton went there at the very end of his life and he died there like within a year of arriving in Maine. So it seems probably like the New English Canaan to some extent is colonial promotional literature about a place that has a great deal of potential but needs to be saved from these like horrible colonists by you, the great noble reader, the noble sort of Anglican aristocratic reader. And that's partly why he leaves so many breadcrumbs that he hopes people will appreciate from their own kind of classical educations. It's been proposed that one of the reasons though why he targeted the particular publisher he did in Amsterdam, who mostly was publishing like literature for Protestant dissenters, was that he also just had a kind of fetishistic desire for this book to be read by the people he knew would contest it, and that he hoped that there was going to be a wide sort of hate readership of Puritans. But I don't think that we have any evidence that there ever was.
It makes for a weird way in which these two very different things end up resembling each other, because of course famously one can say about the Beehive that nobody read it. And so here we have a printed book from an earlier century that may also have been read by nobody.
And it's interesting that in the Beehive there's one moment where, despite dedicating it to his sons, he does write very explicitly that he hopes other people will read it and learn from it. He says that it would sad, not glad his heart. But the one other thing with Morton that is, I think has nothing to do with intended audience, but just it is a book that has this sort of strange later life. The illustration I showed early on, that was kind of that almost like abstract sketch of Morton around the maypole. That was the illustration in 1837 that went with a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne about Marymount. So, in the 19th century, Hawthorne was really interested in Morton. Robert Lowell kind of wrote a little play about Morton that gets performed sometimes. I think there's an opera about Morton. And then in 2011, the Massachusetts governor, Deval Patrick, named May Day Thomas Morton Day, which really, I learned that like last week. And I was living there at the time, and that didn't really I was in maybe my freshman year of high school.
That
We
is
didn't really
completely
talk
bizarre.
about that.
I wonder if I can put a couple things on the table. This is really a fantastic project and conversation. part of it has to do with the fact that Roger and I were just teaching Juliet Fleming on graffiti, which is a good thing for you to look at. Her argument, so my question is about public writing and public epigrammatic culture and writing in spaces, in reality and in rhetoric. Fleming argues that there's writing everywhere in early modern England, on all kinds of surfaces and places and domestic public, and that it is never sanctioned. It is essentially, perfectly acceptable. And of course, and she has a surprising amount of evidence, that survives. There's always this problem, like, so what, I guess one question is, do we have any possibility of any evidence of public epigrams in early New England or early Pennsylvania? A, and B, both of your folks here are using the culture of the epigram, using the culture of public writing rhetorically. And it really seems so important to both of them, opposites though they are. And I'd like to get back about how different they are, but we can in a second, to make epigrams central to their written and printed work. Why?
Yeah, I mean, a part of me does think that one of the sort of like catch-22s, but also maybe interesting things about this project in this line of thinking is that it seems maybe to some extent, like we mostly know about these epigrams as they are written about. It's mostly writing about writing. And it does seem like for these kinds of polemical and somewhat adversarial writers who want to kind of heroize themselves as like great dissenters, lowercase d dissenters in public space, it seems to me as though there's something like braggadocious and maybe overblown about the extent to which early New England or early Pennsylvania are portrayed as like worlds of epigraphs. And so in some ways that speaks, I think, a little bit to the conversation that Liliana and I were having about the sort of two-way direction of reading practices, because on the one hand, I think that this maybe plants the idea in a reader's heads that this sort of epigraphic culture was bigger than it was. But on the other hand, perhaps it does then inspire or animate future moments in which we know that there was a great deal of graffiti, affixed text, inscribed text as a kind of protest tool. Like we know that this would continue, especially in the case of like subverted Bible verses, become a very important tactic of many moments in the history of abolition. We know that like prisoners in the American Revolution were engaged in a kind of forms of protest that had to do a lot with affixed writing. And so I do think that there's sort of a story about the early northern colonies and their love of epigraphs or epigrams that like maybe is partly a fiction, but has an influence on readerly practices and on public life later on.
That's great. That's fantastic. I mean, I guess I would just follow up with one point. I do think it's so interesting and weird to put Thomas Morton and Francis Daniel Pastorius in the same even world. And one way in which it's weird to me, provocative, is weird, it is around what you just said. I think it seems like Morton sees everybody as an enemy. And Pastorius sees everyone as a friend.
Yes.
And that to me has them on different planets. Say more.
No, I think you're 100% right, because I think that like,
I mean, friend, obviously, and I mean friend in both the senses.
that's true. And I think that, for Pastorius, that kind of one of the reasons why he abandons the capital F friend methodology for like naming, he early on in the Beehive's full of just lists of books. That's one of the things you find a lot throughout this commonplace book. And early on, Pastorius does the whole like, these are books by Quakers, these are books by non-Quakers as a dividing line. And then eventually he abandons it and starts mixing things together, or clumping writers together on different ways. And I think one of the things that that does is like I think it becomes a way in which Pastorius reaffirms that that sort of Appian method of not necessarily making presumptions based on like who the author is or where they come from, but assuming that any text can have within it a kind of knowledge worth extracting. And that speaks to his sort of everyone's a potential friend ideal, which is to say, I see what I think is interesting about both Morton and Pastorius is that both of them are figures who spend a lot of time ragging on Europe and spend a lot of time declaring their opposition to present practices happening in the colonies in the way that they want to see things go a different way toward a kind of utopian end. And so in those ways, and Pastorius, even Morton kind of depicts himself as like a martyr and as a sort of, someone who's always on the run and always being thrown out. Pastorius doesn't have quite the same victim complex, but he really thinks of himself as an exile. He talks about his leaving Europe as a state of exile. He talks about feeling like an exile within the colony. So in some ways, I see Morton and Pastorius as both figures who are dancing this fine line between like very voluntary, peaceful pastoral retirement and a sort of bitter sense of their own exile from two worlds that they can't quite find a place within. But you're right that Pastorius, who would I rather have a beer
Convince
with?
me.
I would say Morton would be more fun, but
Yeah, if you were in this.
It goes back to England.
he does, and then he comes back though.
Comes back.
Yeah, he goes back and forth a few times. He's sort of, no one wants him, so he keeps getting shuttled. Like during the English Civil War, he gets in some trouble as a royalist agitator, so he goes right back to like Massachusetts Bay where they remember him and I say no thank you, and then he goes back to England and he's arrested there and made to stand trial and possibly spend the rest of his life in prison. But he gets very sick and knows he's going to die within a few years. So they make a deal with Gorges that he can go to your homeland of Maine to spend the rest of his life. Yes,
Man.
you know it.
Any final questions or thoughts? If not, I'll read a lovely chat statement from Jim Duffin. The famous Pastorius epigraph on his house, Pastorius's house, did lead William Penn to encourage action. As Pastorius described it, Penn, quote, burst into laughter and encouraged me to keep on building. So with that, please keep on building this amazing project because we're looking forward to more.